Hello, UCA. This is Christopher Cole from the Big Toe Sports Show. You're listening to Bear 91.3 KUCA Conway, and it is time for my Big Toe Sports Show that is always on Fridays at 2. I want to tell you guys thank you for listening, and I think I've already brought us in with want to be starting something. I think it's time to be starting something, if you catch my drift. All right, well, on today's docket, we're going to have at least 2 stories about the world of football. For those of you who are interested, the Ted Wells report has just recently come out and has convicted 3 of the Miami Dolphins offensive linemen in what is being known now as one of the biggest anti-bullying, or one of the biggest bullying scams in the past several years. And that reached its conclusion today, and so that's something that I feel like would be important to talk about. And second of all, we're going to talk about a new rule change that Mike and Mike discussed about today that Golick got pretty fired up about, and I hold similar opinions with. So let's start the day with the Ted Wells report coming from the Miami Dolphins. Now, let's just give you a basic recap of what's happened for the Miami Dolphins organization. The day before the Dolphins played the Bengals on Thursday Night Football, Jonathan Martin had an incident where he was pranked in the cafeteria. Jonathan Martin is a tackle for the Miami Dolphins. He had an incident where he feels like he was attacked by a couple of his teammates on the offensive line, most notably guard Richie Incognito. Incognito and Martin lined up but with each other on Sundays, and were responsible for blocking the defensive linemen the defensive linemen that were on the left side of the offensive line. They were a team taking care of those 2 guys on the left side of the line, and they were apparently good buddies from what it seemed like to the team members and just about everybody else. But the Wells report has given us something different. The Wells report looks at an incident where Richie Incognito was pranked in the cafeteria. To my knowledge, the details are still unknown. And, or not Richie Incognito, but Jonathan Martin was pranked in the cafeteria by Richie Incognito, by Jonathan Jerry, Mike Pouncey, and other members of the offensive line. And Martin could not, he had an emotional breakdown in the middle of the cafeteria, stormed out of the Miami Dolphins facility, and checked himself into rehab, where he was not seen for several days. This was the day before the Dolphins played the Cincinnati Bengals, which was a very important game in the Dolphins season, as it had a really good shot at helping them get into the playoffs this year. So he just showed up unexpectedly, and what happened for that game is I believe Richie Incognito went and played tackle. They brought in Nate Gardner. Oh no, Nate Gardner played left tackle, while Tyson Claybo played right tackle, and the Dolphins did a serviceable job, and they won the game in overtime off of a Cameron Wake safety. I remember watching the game myself, being a Miami Dolphins fan, and being overjoyed by the fact the Dolphins had actually won a game, because they had lost 2 previous to that. But the whole Jonathan Martin story was holding over a lot of people, and since that time, people started to figure out where Martin had been, and through a long, in the months, I guess, since that date in November, a lot of, stuff has come out about how Richie Incognito was supposed to be having harassed Jonathan Martin, calling him racial slurs and making jokes about his sexuality and other things. And so for the longest time, in the weeks afterwards, when the Dolphins were, the season was still going on, the Dolphins still had a few games to play, people were feeling like Richie Incognito was a bad guy, and the whole anti-bullying saga had reached one of its biggest points in recent history. But through subsequent through subsequent interviews of Dolphins players, notable players like the Dolphins franchise quarterback Ryan Tannehill and Pro Bowl receiver Brian Hartline came out in defense of Incognito. Many players saying that it seemed as if that Richie Incognito and Jonathan Martin were best of friends. And I actually remember Ryan Tannehill saying in an interview, if you had asked Jonathan Martin who his best friend on the team was 2 weeks ago, the 2 weeks ago being the 2 weeks before the Bengals game, Jonathan Martin would have said Richie Incognito. And for a fan in that perspective, it almost, and as a football player myself, I've known that you know, I mean, people have thrown around several types of racial or, you know, or any types of, you know, not even criticisms, but in joking banter about somebody's sexuality or, you know, or their race, or, you know, we'll just joke around about different things, and sometimes, you know, touchy topics like that are on the docket. And that's just the way that, you know, locker rooms are. People will make fun of each other, they'll tease each other, and it's part of what people would consider the locker room atmosphere. So it just is what happens. And so for me, I had always written it off as just one of these cases where Jonathan Martin, I honestly had been bothered at Jonathan Martin because, you know, the Dolphins needed him to play. He was probably one of the better players on an offensive line that had been struggling for such a long time. I was bothered with him because it just seemed like he was the one that needed to play. But as time has gone on, I think this report has changed my thought in the whole matter. You know, just for more context, I'm a person that tends to side with, not always, but when I look at a situation where bullying has been looked at or is perceived to have been happen, I tend to look at things from the bully's point of view, just because I know that, you know, there was an instance when I was younger and I said, you know, where I felt like I was being bullied by one of my good friends, and in our distance the distance between us kind of soured the relationship. He was a guy that would just tease me or whatever about, not even just tease me, but he was a guy that, you know, we'd play, we'd say things to each other, we'd have fun, and I felt like, I mean, I don't even remember, of course this is in 3rd or 4th grade, exactly what he said, but I do remember how it had bothered me for a little bit. And so for the longest time, I never felt, I finally said, Mom, this guy is bullying me. And of course my mom took action and talked to the principal of the school. We lived in a small town at the time, so you know, just communication with the principal was really easy. And so after that, the principal took, you know, actions regarding the situation, and a lot of teachers made sure that we wouldn't sit together at lunch. And, you know, for a long time there was a lot of distance between the two of us, and I wasn't 100% sure why that had happened. And to be honest with you, the guy was one of my best friends. And so when I look at the situation now, I can really, I feel like I never really was bullied. Like, he and I just were, you know, we're boys and we were talking to each other. And I never felt harassed in the least bit by what he was, like the words that he had said to me. And quite honestly, I mean, I was a very nice kid. I think when I was, I mean, my mom says I was a nice kid when I was in 3rd or 4th grade. So let's take that bias into account. But I felt like, you know, I was a pretty nice kid. But, you know, there were probably 1 or 2 things I said to him that he could have felt like I was bullying him for. So I tend, in the bullying situations, I have that instance in my life where I look back and I say, I don't really know if that was bullying, and I regret how our friendship kind of worsened a little bit after that. Now, you know, just for those of you who are interested in my personal life, in the years afterwards, the guy and I became really good friends. We went on, you know, we both lived in Montana, and so we went to, I went on a, you know, special retreat with him and his mom in Glacier National, Glacier National Park, which was beautiful, a lot of fun. And we had a great time together. We played football together temporarily in 7th grade. We had a lot of, like, atheist and Christian, like, we kind of walked through the great questions of life as 3rd and 4th grade. Not the great questions, of course, but what we could understand of the great questions of life as 3rd and 4th graders. And I had a great time, and this guy is very special in my heart. But again, you know, bringing this into the context of what's going on in the sports world right now, this context that I have from my past has really influenced the way that I see bullying, and I try to make sure, because I know that the bully often doesn't have a voice when the bullied, I should say, comes public, you know, and says this is what's happened. And I feel like they're a minority that sometimes is underrepresented, and sometimes that's okay. I mean, there's often situations, of course, and I know that I'm probably alienating myself, but there's a lot of situations where there's people who have really been bullied, and the action has, you know, come out of a heart of the bully that's absolutely wrong. It's morally incorrect, and they should not have been doing what they were doing, and they were honest, and they were intent to hurt the other individual. And I'm not in particularly talking about situations like that, but I tend to see the situation as just always playful banter that's sometimes misinterpreted. I know that the bullies usually have, feeling. I know that there's like three types of reasons why bullies do what they do, and it's usually all based upon past insecurities. And so I feel like if bullies are treated per se, and you look for these past insecurities and figure out what you can do to help these people get over these things, then bullying doesn't happen in the first place, and they don't need to be punished for acting out upon other people. Instead, you can just fix the problem and it never happens again. So that's my usual take on the situation. In context with what Jonathan Martin and Richie Incognito have done, I took that stance too. I know that Richie Incognito is a player who, when he played for the Buffalo Bills and St. Louis Rams, was a guy who had a lot of trouble, got in a lot of fights, was quick to anger. And honestly, when the Dolphins had picked him up, I remembered the story, and I was a little bit bothered about it. I was a little bit in me that said, ooh, this might not be good. But there was a lot of part of me that said, I think the Dolphins have the facility and the team that can change him. Because the guy was a fantastic talent at the University of Nebraska. And honestly, I'm always up for more offensive line stability. And if that comes in the form of a reckless player that can be treated, then I think that that's something I'd love to take in. And, before this whole saga endured, NFL Network did an interview with Richie Incognito just about his life and about how he felt like he had changed. And he gave some insight into some of the crazy stuff that he would do while he was a member of the Rams and the Bills. And quite honestly, it was really eye-opening to see somebody have to go through that much trauma, as an individual. But, in addition to all of that, he really looked like he was a guy that had turned the page from his past actions. I remember a particular instance when the Dolphins were playing the Texans in a preseason game, and Martin Incognito had gotten tangled up with a Texans player who then proceeded to take off Incognito's helmet and swing it at his unprotected face. For most people, regardless of past history, that's a situation that is quick to start a brawl or to run away. And considering the fact that Richie Incognito was ready to start a brawl over lesser things in his past history with the Bills and Rams, it would only seem right that he would retaliate by tackling the guy, trying to beat him up, starting a fight that would probably be pretty notable in the NFL, and probably be the top story in SportsCenter. But Incognito watched the guy throw a helmet at his face and stood there and waited for referees and the Houston Texan teammates to corral the guy, and stood his ground, didn't even say a word, and walked off the field. And I felt like that was a moment of great maturity for him, and he had come full circle in his actions and his antics. So I've been, at the beginning of the season, Richie Incognito is a good guy. Since the situation, of course, they've shown us some of the text messages that have gone on between Incognito and Martin, and it looks pretty bad. Of course, I would suggest any of you guys reading the actual text messages that the two men sent apart, but it's full of vulgar language and pretty indecent stuff that I'm not proud to say. But if you read the text messages like I did, it would almost seem like the two of them were good buddies. And though, Richie Incognito had called Jonathan Martin blank and blank and blank, Jonathan Martin had responded by calling Richie Incognito, by, hurling similar insults back at them. And so it almost seemed like twisted, playful banter between two friends. And so again, I was on Incognito's side. What changed today is the Wells report. And this has changed my perspective altogether. What the Wells report says, the Wells report basically claims a few things about what has happened in the Dolphins locker room. For those of you who don't know, the Dolphins and the NFL has decided to put an investigation into the whole situation to make sure to figure out what exactly happened. In addition, an outside source has come to the Dolphins, and his name is, he's a criminal investigator named Tim Wells, and he has come into the situation and is trying to determine what has happened to the Dolphins franchise, why they're acting the way they're acting, and look all the specifics behind it. And I've got an article from Bleacher Report up about what the Ted Wells report basically says. One, it confirms that all these allegations of bullying had been happening, and that Richie Incognito wasn't the only Dolphins player who engaged in the harassing behavior. Page 9 of the report says that Mike Pouncey, and who is the Dolphins Pro Bowl center and possibly the only offensive lineman of the Dolphins that actually has any type of skill. Sorry, I'm venting as a Dolphins fan. Offensive line that was just absolutely